apology for the arrest. Now he wants to help those particular defendants that have been damaged. There's another article in the paper this week, a report of spying by Chicago cops, and it's an expose of Richard Daley, the mayor, and the plan to receive information about ordinary citizens, the police intelligence agents, and the dossiers on hundreds of citizens, including the president of the University of Notre Dame, the Republican State's Attorney of Cook County. The Chicago Daily News reported a list of private citizens who always believed that they were immune and that these things were happening just to Black Panthers or radicals, and now it turns out that there's dossiers to control these particular people. There's another article from the New York Times this week. The CIA link to Howard Hughes is reported and disclosed by the burglary on the West Coast. We've talked about the burglary of the Summa Corporation in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Police Department offered $1 million for the contents of these 2 foot lockers, and inside those lockers is more than the Los Angeles Police Department and California officials want you to know. There's a special $1 million fund set up for the information, and they covered up by explaining that this was the barge that brought up the Russian submarine. This particular Hughes operation was exposed because of the burglary and that $350 million fiasco for the 40 dead Russians who've been down there for 17 years. But what is really in this safe, and the government is offering money to keep it from being told, is information about public officials, and the FBI and the police department are anxious to keep the lid on that. But we'll hear more about the Hughes safe. This week there was an exposure of James McCord, who said the truth hasn't been told of the relationship of Howard Hughes to the White House and to the CIA. McCord saying that little bit of information as he stepped out of the car and into jail to begin to serve time for his role in the Watergate burglary. But James McCord had meetings at the office of Mr. Bennett and Ms. Mullen Associates, the public relations firm in Washington, D.C., and that firm represented Howard Hughes and ITT, and James McCord met there with E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. And the head of that organization, Mr. Bennett, moved to California to be in charge of public relations for the Hughes Corporation in 1974 after the election mandate was over for Richard Nixon. And McCord is hinting there's a higher link of Howard Hughes to government, and we know there is, and in the news you'll be seeing the tentacles of the control of judges and police and district attorneys and senators and House of Representatives and all walks of life to use money buying these officials, and this is why the Congress seems dead, the Assembly seems dead, because their campaigns have been bought, or the blackmail is on them through these people like Mr. Tony Lasowitz, who photograph people. There's another article this week about the Internal Revenue, the tax-paying division of our government, who hires women. 2 women have surfaced who prostitutes who work for the government and get information on judges, local judges. These 2 were from Miami. They were talking. And district attorneys. There's a district attorney down there, Gerstein, who was investigating the Watergate. They get information on these people and get them to sleep with women, and women use them to pass information on their personal lives or habits, the Internal Revenue. And then the investigations that are in the best interest of us are stopped because the judges are controlled, the district attorneys are controlled. Do you ever wonder why there were so many lawsuits after Watergate happened and hardly any of them went to court? Because there was evidence on the different people involved, and the computer and data banks are working, and the Internal Revenue was funding down in Miami, probably all over the country, but 2 particular women spoke up in Miami. Another article came out this last week. Secret Service lists 47,000 people who are threats to officials. They have a list of these individuals who are considered extremely dangerous, and they now have an intelligence gathering system of 47,000 people that they watch because they consider them dangerous. I remember when I read the John Kennedy assassination investigation of the protection of Kennedy, and Mr. Lawson from Secret Service was called to testify. And he went to that area of the Secret Service. He was in charge of the Dallas motorcade. He went to the area of Secret Service and asked, is there anyone in Dallas, Texas that would be a threat to the life of John Kennedy? And he testified under oath that in 10 minutes he left the office and was told nobody. And yet after John Kennedy was killed, there were many letters and documents of real threats to his life, but the Secret Service, with all of their money and their special service staff, only pull in information about particular people, and it doesn't matter what their budget is, how many people they have. Robert Kennedy is killed. Ted Kennedy was in danger. He was in a plane crash, and then he was caught in this intrigue at Chappaquiddick. George Wallace was shot, and President Kennedy was killed. These lists grow, but they're against private citizens, and then when it comes to protect public figures, they're not protected at all. The budget goes, as I say, to protect certain people, but the intelligence gathering terrorizes others without stopping the assassin. When they want to get their mark, they get there, and all of this gathering of 47,000 lists is superfluous and has nothing to do with who's behind the actual danger to people involved. There was another article in the Washington Post this week. Title was "Informant Says the Police Urge Theft." It was by Paul Valentine. A former Washington, D.C. policeman contended yesterday that he was instructed to supervise mail, to steal mail, to break into buildings, to disrupt the legitimate demonstrations and anti-war movements. He was taught on a salary of $50 to $75 a month. He broke into a bookshop. Then in Washington, D.C., he took anti-war petitions. He stole paper bags filled with mail that went to the Institute of Policy Study. He disrupted street demonstrations. He gave false information in times and locations of rallies. He yanked out the wires and tubes of sound systems. This is a man paid by the Washington, D.C. police. He went public in 1973, and now he is appealing for people in Washington to investigate the jobs that he did while he was working for the police department in Washington, D.C. There's another article about a black pastor got an FBI threat in 1969. This is a New York Times article last week, March 17th. The FBI sent a spurious, threatening letter in 1969 to a black Baptist minister to compel him to cease his civil rights work in Mississippi and get to the north. The man was Donald W. Jackson, who's now known as Muhammad Kenyatta. They sent a letter to his home in April 69. He said the main decision to leave the Jackson Human Rights Project the following month and return to Pennsylvania was a letter sent by the FBI. If you wonder where the black leaders are, where the civil rights movement was, why there's so many people unemployed in the black community and no spokesman for them, here's an example of a black leader that was sent home. He wasn't murdered, but forced to leave the job that he was doing by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been used by the racists, by the people that want to hold black, the black Chicanos, the Indian movement, the poor whites, the prison movement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was set up to investigate crimes. The CIA was set up to investigate sabotage to this country and other countries, to pick up and gather information. And as you see, week after week, it's gushing out so fast. The FBI and CIA have been used not only overseas, but in this country to do the kind of thing that is being exposed now. Mr. Kenyatta got a letter from the FBI. This is the way it went. It said, should you feel that this is a hollow directive and not heed our diplomatic and well thought out warning, we shall consider contacting local authorities regarding some of your activities, or take measures available to us which would have a more direct effect and which would not be as cordial as this note. And with that, Mr. Jackson left the Mississippi office, left his civil rights movement, went north to Pennsylvania, and the civil rights movement lost an active leader. And now it turns out that this letter was fabricated by the FBI as a COINTELPRO operation. It was written and fabricated that it came from somebody else, and they kicked that man out of Mississippi and sent him north. And his choices weren't many, because if he stayed south, he would have been killed like Medgar Evers or killed like Whitney Young. There was a Supreme Court decision that came down. I heard it on the radio just as I came to KLRB today, that provocateurs may not be enrolled in college. to inform and gather information. The Supreme Court decided that if you commit a crime, a policeman will be there or men should wear uniforms, but no longer may students be disguised as they may not be police agents disguised as college students and actually informants for the government. That'll drop about 1/3 of the enrollment of every college student and allow the taxpayers maybe to put money back into legitimate college students, but it's a good decision and it's on the right track. I also want to tell you that March 25th on Thursday night, Hidalgo Rivera is going to have a national television show. I believe it comes on at 12 o'clock at night. It's the one where they showed the Zapruder films a month ago, and there was an overwhelming response to the program. So this time it's called Good Night America. He's going to have an hour and a half, if you can stay awake in the late night and early morning, on the John Kennedy assassination. There'll be various researchers back there. It's photographed in New York. Arlene Specter was supposed to be on. I announced it last week, but he has declined for obvious reasons. He couldn't take this confrontation. He's a member of the Warren Commission. He's declined the invitation, but be sure to catch it on Thursday, the 25th at about 12 o'clock. Mark your calendar because it goes pretty fast. I want to do the bulk of the show today on the SLA story because we haven't done much each week on Dialogue Conspiracy. We've been into the John Kennedy assassination and news on the FBI and CIA exposures recently. But I do want to talk about the SLA story because it's very much in the news, and I did write the story last year, went to a great length on why was Patricia Hearst kidnapped. And this last week there have been 3 major articles in the newspaper or series. One is regarding a Mr. Scott, the Jack Scott, the sports critic and writer, the activist. The news calls him an activist, and the exposures that he allegedly provided transportation for the SLA from Las Vegas to New York to 92nd Street and then to a house in Pennsylvania and provided a white van for them. And he also allegedly rented a car in Palo Alto or Menlo Park and drove it within a mile of where Romero and Little had a hearing, and it was parked near a courtroom where if they had made escape, the car might have been available for them. That's Mr. Jack Scott. The FBI says our aim is to find Miss Hearst, not Miss Scott. They called Mr. Scott's father in, who proclaimed the grand jury is on a witch hunt. They wouldn't ask the man who's directly involved, just the father. The FBI says if he walks up to us, okay. If not, we don't want him. There was another article in the news just today, as a matter of fact, called Revolutionary's Flight from the SLA, and it's about Ulysses and Barbara McDaniel. And then there was an article in the Washington Post again, a large article on the CIA and their relationship to the Washington, D.C. police. And I want to talk about those 3 articles and what's happening in the SLA and what the excuse was for the creation of the SLA again. I want to go over it again with you because the Washington, D.C. police justify the CIA being in the police department on the basis of the fact that the Weather Underground evolved from the peace movement and that the SLA grew out of prison reform. And I want to talk about the difference between the SLA and genuine prison reform. This program reaches many of the men in prison at Soledad, in California, in Vacaville, and Folsom. And I want to go into my opinions of the SLA for what they're worth and for other people in the country. And you can see how the news breaks in relationship to the articles that I wrote on this. In the summer of 1974, I said in the Realist that the SLA was created by the Central Intelligence Agency. One black man formed the SLA. That was Colston Westbrook of the CIA, who was in Southeast Asia for 7 years, studying behavior modification, and then moved to California right into the security of Vacaville prison. And Vacaville is known for behavior modification and control of various persons in select groups, either through, it used to be psychosurgery, electrode implants, hypnosis, and drugs. And the master, Colston Westbrook, came from Southeast Asia 7 years right to the Vacaville prison in California. And he formed the Black Cultural Association, which became the SLA. That's exactly where it started, in California prison. The SLA used two black men. One was Donald DeFreeze and the other is Thurl Wheeler. DeFreeze, like Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby, has been murdered, and Thurl Wheeler is not even sought by the police. DeFreeze was cremated in Los Angeles in the May 17th massacre of the LA SWAT team. I maintain the creation of the SLA was to hit as many areas as they could with increased police force, with the tax squads on the streets, the SWAT teams, to bring out the police, to bring out the FBI, and another reason was to stop prison visits and expose, try to keep people from the middle class America that were beginning to get interested into prison reform, to keep them out from stirring trouble inside the prison system. The prisons used to be pretty tight and closed until a new group of people began to question the California prisons and the eastern prisons, and the purpose of this is to screen out the visitors, particularly the activists who are most likely to expose the system. I know for a fact, out from Soledad here, from correspondence with men in prison that are locked up tight now, that members of the prison community were offered parole if they would join the SLA. And this was after Patty Hearst was kidnapped. One prisoner I know of in particular was offered a chance to escape if he would kill somebody on the outside. I knew and talked about on the radio shows that they were planning a second wave of SLA ex-prisoners that they would give parole to if they would kidnap Patty Hearst's sister and take her to Colorado. The news talks about Colorado as a safe house, and that doesn't surprise me. I've mentioned it on many shows. Now, in order to take off this giant step of offering parole, of offering safety to murder, of offering freedom from jail to become part of a terrorist group, it takes a lot of tactical support. It takes the use of the news media, the CIA, the FBI that allows these people to get away, the local police departments, and the Department of Corrections, and all of them have been behind his organization. The supporting of Mr. Scott and not wanting him to testify. He was even wanted on a car rental down in Burlingame, where he rented this car for San Mateo to take it up to Sacramento. The FBI dropped the charges on that. They don't want him unless he drags in. They're not even going to ask him where he's been. But before there was a Scott offering all this tactical support, I wrote last summer in May and June of '74 about the tactical support of the original SLA, the persons that rented the safe house on 7th Avenue in Oakland, the black man who kidnapped Patty Hearst that was never sought by the police, along with Donald DeFreeze, the persons who rented the two green cars when they went into the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. They had tactical support in the bank, knowing which doors and windows. The president of the bank mentioned it and knew it. The relationship of Mr. and Mrs. Christine Johnson in Los Angeles before they moved there. I wrote in the article who purchased the 3 white vans they had, who were the 2 black men with Patty, and blue and white vans, who purchased the 3rd white van. And there were safe houses in Los Angeles. There were 2 black men with Patty Hearst in Hollywood. There's transportation in Hollywood from Mulholland Drive to Griffith Park on May 17th. Who was Tom Matthews, who allegedly was kidnapped by the SLA. They had a safe house on 54th Street at the time the others were cremated. Now, this was tactical support by the police department and the FBI, the same kind that Mr. Scott is getting right now. He allegedly provided housing in Pennsylvania, housing in New York, transportation from Vegas. Was he the one who gave the white van from L.A. up to Vegas? The tactical support of the FBI is to not seek the people who are helping them, and their answer was this week, we've already interviewed 27,000 people, and we're not looking for Mr. Scott. Well, who are the 27,000 they've interviewed? Lesbians, people living on communes, persons driving Volkswagen buses, black former prisoners, black people on the street that look suspicious of being with Patty Hearst, breaking into apartments of young people, barging the door in and saying, are you Patty? Anti-war protesters, members of the United Prisoners Union are being harassed by the FBI constantly, the farm workers group, but not Jack Scott, a man that they know is positively, as close as anybody could say, involved. The FBI isn't interested who provides the buses, who provides the housing, and it's not because the FBI likes radicals. This is the thing that people have to remember who are involved or swear by the SLA as being a genuine group. The police department, the law enforcement would love to get them. They only get away because they want them to, because they are not looking for the persons who are supplying the tactical support. Now, today's paper had an article by Ulysses McDonald. It was an interview with Ulysses McDonald, a young man who was in the California prisons 10 years, who was in a cell at George Jackson, solitary confinement for a long time. And the title of the article is Revolutionaries' Flight from the SLA. Now remember that nobody in the Bay Area of a radical group was interested in Joseph Romero, Russell Little, or Donald DeFreeze. They didn't like their tactics. They felt they were authoritarian. And then when Dr. Marcus Foster was killed, they had nothing to do with them. But this is the first prisoner to say that he fears for his life. And McDaniel suggested that he was being recruited by the SLA because he was black and because he was from prison. And the article in the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle, claims that he was more afraid of the SLA than he was of the parole officers. His girlfriend, who became his wife, bought weapons, and they left their home in the Bay Area to move to Canada. They were held on a gun charge up in Seattle because they were going into Canada with weapons. And they were armed because they were afraid of the SLA. Because I'm positive, if we could speak with Ulysses McDaniel now, that he was offered parole. He was in pretty tight, according to good authority. A person who knew him in prison told me they were surprised that he got parole. And I'm sure that he's one of these people that was told, among the other men I know at Soledad, we'll give you your parole date if you join the SLA. And he was out, and the SLA said, we need you because we need black people. And this is what I said in my article. It's made of white middle-class persons who are using the blacks to instigate, now that the civil rights movement is dead, the legitimate reform is dead, to get the black people out on the streets. And this McDaniel fled because he was more afraid of the SLA and what they would do to him now that he had his parole than he would be of the parole officer. And anyone who knows the prison system has to admit that's a pretty heavy statement to state. Now, the importance of the Ulysses McDaniel is this, that another prisoner whose name comes up in the SLA, his name is Death Row Jeff, his real name is Clifford Jefferson, was the man who wanted to see Randolph Hearst when Patty was kidnapped, who worked with the FBI in the prison system, and Death Row Jeff was corresponding to Ulysses McDaniel, who goes by the nickname U. And a letter went out of the prison by this Death Row Jeff, to the effect, what he said was he was glad McDaniels had a girlfriend, who later became his wife, and this is, in quotes, the letter. He says, girlfriends are good to have around. That is why I want one, to carry word back and forth. We are going to move now. Now, the only way that this particular Clifford Jefferson will get out, I'm positive, is to work with the authorities. So he sends a letter from inside prison out, which is photographed, that makes the Chronicle, that girls are good to have around. That's why I want one, to carry word back and forth. We're going to move now. So what happens when you write to a man in the prison system? I've written to very many of them, and I've always been very conscious that it wasn't a letter between me and the recipient. It was a letter between me, the recipient, the state of California, or the whole world, because every letter you write is photographed. And anyone who says that friends are to carry messages back and forth, that there's a revolution going, only gives an excuse for the prison officials to cut down on the visitors, to cut down on the legitimate reform. And the men that are allowed, that are getting parole to join the SLA, are going to find that there is no SLA. It's instigated by white America. It's instigated by people like Emily William Harris, Indiana teachers, members of the Mod Squad, well-educated, not involved with prison reform at all, not interested previously in anything that had to do with American Indians, the black, the poor, well-off people, one working, William Harris, with the post office, one working the University of California in a could be a dummy front organization paid by the government, hasn't been investigated. Another person helping Patty Hearst is Jack Scott with a Ph.D., and his claim to fame as being a great radical is that he wanted black coaches at Oberlin College in Ohio. Ph.D. and a teacher, obviously with a lot of money to give $2,000 rent for a summer cottage in Pennsylvania for them to stay. One of their friends from Oregon, the athlete Walton, just signed a $2 million contract, a basketball player who lives in a $100,000 home. All this talk about radical reform or improving the prisons is done by a few white people who are trying to get movements going, movements of kidnapping, movements of terrorism that have nothing at all to do with prison reform. Not one of these people is synonymous with anything that's happened in the prisons to make the situation better. Now, Mr. Maurice Cullinane, Cullinane, from the Washington, D.C. Police Department, comes out with a article which fits in with what I know is the link of the National Police Department to the CIA, to the SLA, and the SLA becomes national. You see, it isn't a California problem. And this is that article I referred to March the 13th in the Washington Post. The chief of police claims that the police system in America is weak. He's talking about his police department, that the police need the CIA. He said the Weather Underground evolved from the Peace People and the SLA out of prison reform. Now ask yourself in California or wherever, what did the SLA do? They're white Americans living well in well-protected food, transportation, housing taking place. One black member was killed, and they're begging a black member to join who runs out of the country because he's afraid of his life. What prison reforms did the SLA accomplish? What programs did they ever suggest? What was defined as necessary by the SLA to reform the prisons? Who were the prison reformers? And the fact of the case is that American Nazis murdered Dr. Foster, and this was a group of white people not helping the blacks at all, and could be proven with a little bit of investigative work. The SLA had a memo, Feed the Poor. They got $2 million from Randolph Hearst to put cabbages and chickens in some paper bags. There wasn't one word of prison reform. There wasn't a list of demands like there was in Attica. Goodness knows California needs prison reform. There wasn't one suggestion in one of their memos of prison reforms. There wasn't anything that they published that was constructive in terms of prison reform. So the excuse for prison reform of having the CIA and the police department coming out of Washington, D.C., the capital of this country, what did they incorporate into their police department back there to counteract the anti-war people and the civil rights protesters? They used the CIA for the following things, and I read them to you because the CIA is moving into our local police department doing the same things, whether you're in Los Angeles, Boston, New York, Sacramento, San Francisco, all over the country. This is what they were doing in Washington, and there are many police departments. The Washington, D.C. police borrowed the men and cars and equipment to follow the anti-war people and the civil rights. Now remember, to object to a war is not a crime, and a civil rights program is not a crime, and these CIA people were used with the police, their cars and equipment. The police in Washington have used electronic surveillance devices. They monitor local phone calls. This is the admission of the chief of police. There's a 33-page report, 160 pages of documents of what the CIA is doing with the police departments. The CIA aided in personnel training. They spent $1.7 million since 1968, the CIA with the Washington, D.C. police alone. They provided 17 overt investigators, 20 paid informants, unspecified. Number of undercover police officers, unspecified, could run into the thousands. They lent intelligence divisions 5 automobiles with their drivers, which they keep all the time. They provided portable radios. They have radio receivers to monitor major meetings and demonstrations. They maintain individual files on at least 6 local activists well known in the Washington area. The Army and the CIA gave $150,000 to assist in monitoring the city for possible large-scale disturbances. Now, all of this is not to rebuild the city after the riots when Martin Luther King was killed. This is $1.7 million to find out who else is in civil rights movement, who's an anti-war protester. The CIA have aided with photography in Washington, D.C. This is what they admitted there. They had members of the bomb squad experienced in opening locks and locking devices and illegal entries. And remember that when James McCord was arrested at the Watergate Hotel, Just prior to that, he was teaching a university course on CIA surveillance, and one of the assignments was opening into the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The police department uses the CIA lamps, which are capable of intercepting oral conversations that are private, and furthermore, they use specialized training in selecting CIA employees in interrogation techniques. The local police department, since 1940 in Washington, D.C., has been using the Central Intelligence Agency for some of these things. Now that comes to mind certain things like the California slasher. A man was arrested for several charges in Los Angeles, and Ed Davis, the chief of police, says, oh, we're going to charge him with these 9 slashings down in Main Street, downtown Los Angeles. Ed Bush, the district attorney down there, says, no, I can't press the charges. I don't have enough evidence on him. Let me ask you, if the CIA sends out interrogators and techniques, can you get confessions from people that even the DA doesn't think they did it? The evidence doesn't exist because we have these massive murders in California even without confessions. Juan Corona and Herbert Mullen and Mr. Kemper and Frazier. Violence up and down California that is being done by the Central Intelligence Agencies and police agencies, and are getting the wrong people, and through their techniques of interrogation, the innocent are going to jail and the guilty are still out on the street. Now, I bring all this up on Dialogue Conspiracy for several reasons, because I firmly believe that the SLA was begun by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1972. It was kickoff, and Watergate delayed it, and then 74 was the beginning of the first American kidnapping, and terrorism and police state will follow. There's an article by Jack Anderson this week on the 10 worst leaders in the world. A foreign affairs expert sent out a poll to men who are knowledgeable in foreign affairs in 35 key positions, and I bring this to you in connection to SLA for this reason. Almost every one of these heads of states was put into power by the same techniques that the CIA trained in 77 countries and is doing in the police departments in the United States today. And the reason you have the leaders you have all over the world is that you have allowed it at the lower level to take place, to allow the Central Intelligence Agency in the police departments, and not screen out who your coroners are, who's doing the interrogation, where they were trained. And if you want to get rid of a police state, you don't just have an election. In 76, you begin at a very local level, and a good way is to call the shots on the SLA and expose the chain of command from Washington on down to the local FBI and the police departments and the U.S. attorneys, and why they're letting the people who provide the tactical support get away, and chasing the people who don't want to join them so that their lives are in danger, they're put back in jail. These are serious matters that can be investigated right now if you write to your various governors and congressmen. But the Jack Anderson article on the worst leaders in the world the questionnaire was sent to 35 experts in key positions of State Department, Pentagon, and Congress. Some were academicians whose foreign affairs views are respected. A sample was sent to embassies in Washington, and they were asked their question, in your opinion, who are the world's 5 worst leaders in terms of despotism, ineffectiveness, irresponsibility, personal greed, and personal instability. Now this goes into, because I'll read you who the first 5 were, and then it goes down the list of the 10. General Id Alman was voted the very worst. He was, the Foreign Affairs Group said the dictator of Uganda was the world's worst leader, that he was a clown and totally nuts. But the second one was Thieu of Vietnam. We've spent millions and millions of dollars, wasted lives, supported that totally with a CIA government plan from the National Security Council. Thieu of Vietnam was number 2. Number 3 on the list of badly Vietnam, he was called a hush Bush League autocrat. The one on the list was General Augusto Pinochet of Chile. He succeeded Allende in Chile, and because of his cruelties and his lack of human rights, his violations, when he took power, he was the next one. The next one here, they mentioned Mr. Gaddafi, because Colonel Gaddafi with his use of terrorists and that he was dangerous. But the fifth one down is Mr. Lon Nol, because primarily for his ineffectiveness, he's sheer incompetence, sheer ineptness. When he talks, his staff fall asleep. If you open your paper, you read your magazines, you see these burning, bleeding bodies. How can you believe he's not more than ineffective? And then Ferdinand Marcos, that our CIA put in power. There's South Africa's Balthazar Voster we support. And number 9 is President Gerald Ford, who is giving away to the American explorers, and Mr. Park Chung-chi of South Korea. Now, if you want leaders like Mr. Pinochet in Chile, and Lon Nol in Cambodia, and Mr. Park in South Korea, and Marcos in the Philippines, and Gerald Ford, the same kind of people are what you get in America because you have allowed these things to happen, and they're happening in front of you, and you have to stop them at an everyday level. Now, what is genuine prison reform? Is there a genuine group of people working? Yes, there is. I'm going to give you the name of a person you can write to. I'm going to read you a serious letter. I've mentioned his name on the program before. His name is Robert Hyde, and he's so fed up with what's happening inside the California prisons that he's willing to die now if it will take notice to other people of what exactly is happening. And he wants to expose and put his life on the line to expose the things which I talk to you about every week, but he's willing to die for. And I hope you write to him. I'll give you his name, and I'm going to read you a legal notice which he sent to me this week. His name is Robert Hyde. The number is B22512. P.O. Box 441, Chino, California. That's the prison. But you can write to various congressmen and assemblymen on this subject if you want. He said, he mailed me a notice this week, legal notice to all concerned. Please take notice that commencing April the 4th, 1975, I, Robert Hyde, Director of Probe, shall abstain from eating any food until such time as the secret government, the CIA, La Costa, Younger Syndicate, stop using the California prisons to manufacture all types of violence, such as A, racism, B, terror, C, assassinations, and D, economic chaos. Racism is created inside the prison by creating gangs of each race and splitting the races against each other, and then to send them out in the street to murder innocent and helpless citizens. Terror is used by creating the zebras, the zodiacs, Patty Hearst, and other terrors such as the SLA guerrilla soldier that were manufactured in the Frankenstein factory of Vacaville Prison. C, assassinations, the plotting and carrying out of vicious slaying such as done to President John Kennedy, his brother Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Marcus Foster, and others. C, the assassination. D, economic chaos. The government is planning and executing phony crises, runaway inflation, severe unemployment, and other confusion in a situation of chaos, all of which is being done to terrorize and demoralize the people to the point of panic. And then the syndicate can take over the government completely and subject all people to total control by brain operations, sterilization, zombie brain implants. I do not expect to stop the CIA, La Costa, Younger Syndicate, all by myself, so I will most likely die. But perhaps my death will encourage you to think as I do, that it is better to die believing in something good than to live in the midst of corruption and evil. To all my friends and family and all of you, I leave all of my love and best wishes, Robert Hyde. Now, Robert Hyde became known to me last year through Robert Hansen, Sirhan Sirhan's attorney. Hyde was scheduled for psychosurgery at Vacaville because he knew too much about the political assassinations. He knew about the fomenting of the SLA in the California prisons and the use of the syndicate and the mafia to control the drug traffic in the syndicate in the prisons. There were 3 contracts to murder him at Soledad that the officials set up. There was 1 contract at Folsom Prison. We were able, through speaking publicly in San Jose and on the air and reaching the warden at these prisons, to stop the murder contracts and to stop the psychosurgery. And then he was moved away from Folsom and Vacaville and Soledad down to Chino, where he's been in solitary confinement. He has 1 lawsuit against Folsom and the contract to murder him, but he hasn't been successful in moving it. He knows, as I say, how the SLA was formed. He knows about trafficking of narcotics in the prisons, and he knows who was behind the Kennedy assassinations and Martin Luther King. And he is a very valuable human being who is sacrificing or is willing to sacrifice his life to get out this information. I've been corresponding with him for over a year now. And those of you that want to write to Robert Hyde or take an interest in this, he is going on a hunger strike, and I'll bring this next week to you again. Write up to Jerry Brown, the governor. Write to various assemblymen up there. Write to Congress and say that the CIA is supposed to be investigated working domestically in the United States by the Rockefeller Committee and by the Senate Committee and the House of Representatives. And we want the evidence that Robert Hyde has, because he can link all of these things. I sometimes talk about the Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy assassination. I talk about mind control electrodes, the SLA, the manipulation of the zebra killings, and the prisons controlling these persons out on parole to do this violence hypnotically from our California hospitals. All of these things are linked. The terrorism of today to the assassination in Dallas, and Hyde is one of these people who knows it. I received an article, it's called Articles of Discontent, sent by the men in Chino prison. There's a group trying to help these men down there. They've signed, there's 28 men who signed a petition. Robert Hyde was one of 28. It goes into racism down there, that 80 and 85% of the people in the prisons now are black or brown. They do not get due process is violated. They're not getting their legal papers. They're not allowed to move through the courts. Their medical care is nil. The doctors come while they're asleep before breakfast. The only dental care is if a teeth is to be pulled out. The food is greasy and filled with blobs of cartilage and half-cracked wheat and insufficient diet. Rehabilitation, there's no provision for illiterate men to learn to read. There's no hobby or craft. The mail is held up 10 days. It is copied. Some of it is kept indefinitely. The visits are by telephone through 18-inch square of glass, and every conversation is taped. The men in the tier down there have 23 hours a day in their cells with no sun or ventilation, and 24 hours a day of noise of garbage cans, heavy gates, and metal trays. Now, this is a petition of what's wrong in the California prison. These are genuine desires for reform. This has nothing to do with the SLA. Robert Hyde would tell you how the SLA was formed. And in order to stop the police from using it as an excuse, like the Washington, D.C. police, it's imperative to break into the FBI and the police now giving tactical support and protecting the people who are hiding Patty while they're breaking into some lesbian commune in Denver, Colorado, because that isn't where it's at. Well, our time is up now, and this particular hour, 45 minutes, there's a lot happening in the news. I hope some of you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, in addition to your local papers, for some of the story of what's happening. Take care of this week is tucked away. I'll see you next week. Have a nice Easter holiday, and we'll be back next Monday on Dialogue Conspiracy.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussel, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.